Welcome, everyone. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies, at UMich Democracy here at the University of Michigan. Really happy to have you all here for our today's roundtable on the theme of a new era of war and dictators. And let me just give you a little bit about the sense of the premise before my brilliant colleagues and scholars all tear the premise to pieces and tell me why it's the wrong premise. So the idea behind this is sort of thinking about, if we think about the historical moment we're in, we seem to be in a little bit of a new situation where, when the Cold War ended, it seemed like, not every place was a democracy, but it seemed like democracy was becoming the default form of government. Authoritarianism seemed rare or exceptional or something to be explained. And war around the world was mostly civil war. There wasn't a lot of international war happening, not 2000s either. And so we're sort of in this era of, it seemed, pretty robust democracy and international peace, at least in terms of actual international war and conquest compared to prior eras. And now we're in a new moment. And so it seems like authoritarianism is back on the rise. It seems like international war, conflict is back on the rise. When you think about Russia under Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine, you think about the Trump administration and its machinations toward Greenland and Canada. So it kind of raises the question, are the taboos on authoritarianism lifting in some of the world's oldest, richest, wealthiest democracies? Is the taboo kind of lifting on international conquest in the United Nations system? If so, do these things have anything to do with each other? Are there ways in which the rise of authoritarianism and this return of international war are somehow connected, or are they not? And this is not where we should be looking at all. So I thought this was sort of a provocation, and we'll have three sets of really going to be terrific comments from really great scholars on this theme. So by brief introduction. So first, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita is the Julius Silver Professor of Politics at New York University and a Senior Fellow Emeritus at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Also a proud University of Michigan political science graduate. His research focuses on conflict resolution, complex negotiations, and the political economy of development. He develops game theoretic models of international interactions, including being a co-developer of select grid theory. His current research examines how political institutions shape domestic political instability, as well as the trajectories of secularization and economic growth in different parts of Europe. Christian Davenport is the newly crowned and newly christened Charles Tilly Distinguished University Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, as well as a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Korea. His primary research interests include political conflict and violence, measurement, racism, and popular culture. He's the author of over 50 articles and 8 books, most recently, The Death and Life of State Repression with Ben Apple, which is 2022, Oxford University Press. And Megan Stewart is an associate professor at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Her research interests focus on explaining variation in how changes to social, economic, and political hierarchies, especially across racial, gender, class, or religious ethnic lines, are attempted and achieved, and how war or political violence is often the context or consequence of such endeavors. She's the author of Governing for Revolution, 2021 Cambridge University Press, in which she explains why some rebel groups undertake complex and challenging wartime projects to transform social orders by altering hierarchies of power, while most other rebel groups do not. So we're going to go, so Megan will go first, and then Bruce, and then Christian, and then we'll open things up for Q&A. Thank you guys again for coming out.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to stand if that's all right, so I can sort of see. Basically, I thought about Dan's premise, so I wanted to see what the data told me. So I did a little bit of a data collection exercise to get a sense of is there any ground truth to the premise, and if there is, why might we be seeing this? So I turned to data from OPLED, which is one of those premier data sources. And it tells us basically what they say is political violence events are on the rise. However, I wanted to do a little bit of parsing out who's committing this violence. And so in blue, those are forms of political violence committed by the state. In black, those are forms of political violence against the state, so insurgency or local officials. And then in red, we have atrocities, which could be committed by either party, right? And so what I think is really interesting here is that we see political violence events, especially by the state, on the rise. But political violence by insurgencies seem to be declining. Now, I thought perhaps major war, and then in particular, the foreign military political violence events seem to be precipitously increasing. Well, I thought, okay, maybe this is just the war in Ukraine, maybe this is just the war in Gaza. So political violence is mostly by the state. So I exclude Ukraine and I exclude Palestine from events that are targeted. And even then, we still see an increase in state repression, and foreign military engagement by states seems to be eclipsing insurgent events in ways that hadn't been before while the data are being captured. So the data only go back to 2020, and the data for 2024 only go up to mid-October of 2024. So this isn't even complete data for 2024. But in general, the ACLA data set seems to consider most political violence events on the rise. However, it seems like most of those forms of political violence are forms of political violence committed by the state. So now, we also know that democracy kind of comes in waves. So this is drawn from a well-known, well-regarded article in political science, and we see that the global average of democracy has kind of spiked at different periods, one after World War I, one after World War II, and then one again after the end of the Cold War. So we see sort of democratic institutions seem to be coming in waves. We can talk about, this would be a good time to talk, well, maybe down the line we can talk about the validity of this index in general. I have many questions about it, but this is just an overview of the idea of like where democratic waves are. But is this wave possibly ebbing? So I looked data from the same 2020 to 2024 year period to kind of get a sense of comparison. From this data source is VDEM, and so varieties of democracy. And so I'm looking, the black line at the top is the relative composite score, the average democratic score across all countries from 2020 to 2024. But then there's components of it that you can see broken out in blue, red, and gray. And it seems like across all of those components, democracy seems to be on the decline. And indeed, this was what VDEM's conclusion was about the year 2024. So rather than there being a wave of democratization, they called it, quote, a truly global wave of autocratization, which seems to, and perhaps I will be the foil against which all others argue against, but perhaps this might seem where if democracy was the wave, perhaps this is the ebb of it. So why might we be experiencing this? The first question is, or the first point is, perhaps the data that I've shown you just contains significant measurement error. And we need to really interrogate, and especially with questions of democracy, I think we should really interrogate the variables that we're using in particular. But it's but we are also facing real global challenges, and it is that simultaneously and around the world. And so the first is global challenges in terms of anti-democratic activism. So we see authoritarians around the world working together, collaborating together, and working with each other to learn from one another and how to both gain and maintain political power. We also are, at least from my perspective, we see an ill-prepared response to technological innovations, and we know that the technology that we're consuming has real implications for the way we understand and interact with society, understanding the difference between what's real and what's not, and also that those experiences shape our perceptions in ways that could also shape behavior. So this challenge is global. In some cases, there's an inability, or in other cases, like technology companies have sort of fused with basic state utility services in ways that have kind of deepened the technological crisis that or crises that we might be facing. We also know that international regime types are typically tied to hegemonic systems, in addition to war. So war and major power war is often tied to hegemony. And we have heard quite often that the US is in decline as the hegemon. So perhaps what we're seeing is linked evidence of the US being in decline as a hegemon. And then I also thought about the role of domestic inequalities, because domestic inequalities might shape the proclivity for authoritarianism, and it might also shape who, like, sort of, if your leaders tend to be more, if you elect a certain amount of leaders, or if that's the zeitgeist, they might be more willing to go to war. So I thought about how political equalities work and inequalities were not changing domestically. And so we know that income inequality is widening, right? So there is an increasingly wealth and economic resources are concentrated in the hands of the few. At the same time, there are some social inequalities that are reducing. In no way do I mean to imply that this is equality at all. However, we also know that the reduction in social inequalities can be tied to reactionary violence against the person. So are we seeing increases in either state repression or increases in violence against others because as like a reactionary reaction to reductions in social inequalities? And I thought that these are processes that if the entire world is sort of experiencing increases in political violence events, as well as declines in sort of democraticness, these are some challenges that we might be experiencing globally. So then I wanted to think about, I also don't know if any of these are true. So these are just some ideas that I was thinking about, like what might explain some of these patterns. And so I wondered, can it change? And I think the answer is yes. So like, I think if this is indeed a broader trend, a broader pattern, I think it can change, but I think it will take sustained effort and many years. So in other words, I think there's really a paucity of where sort of the anti-democratic activism has been working in place and expanding over the past several decades. I don't think the same infrastructure of pro-democratic activists are there and in place, or at least to the same extent as the authoritarians are. And so I think building that back will take sustained effort and many, many years. I also think that it's going to get harder and harder over time if this is indeed a trend. Because one thing that we know, we know that sometimes either changes to democratic system or regime types can lead to diffusion and can lead to spillover. So if a state becomes increasingly authoritarianism, it might make it easier for another state to become increasingly authoritarian. And so then you're rolling back even more and even more and even more. So not only are you trying to reverse the trend, trying to push back against what's going, but then you also want to try and reverse it, which means years and years of sustained effort. And the longer you take that process down the line, the more challenging it will become to change that. So I'm going to leave it here. That hopefully this is some food for thought. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Hello. So I sort of understood our charge incorrectly. That's all right. I thought we were dealing with democracy's potential decline and violence, not war. And as a product of the Correlates of War Project, I'll just observe that war is a rare event. And so the recent rise, I think a trend does not make, just as I'm reminded that my former colleague from the University of Rochester, John Mueller, wrote a book, I guess about 30 years ago, on how war was obsolete and was not going to happen again. He was looking at a short trend, and we're looking at a short trend. So I want to talk about the return of authoritarianism and violence. I'm not really. I'm quite optimistic. So let me go through why I'm optimistic. I'm quite optimistic that the short-term trends that we are seeing are misleading, that democracy is not in decline, and that there are good theoretical reasons as well as empirical reasons to doubt the claim that democracy is in decline. People make several mistakes in making that claim, in my view. One mistake is to compare, as I will do as well, average levels of measures of things like democracy. Whereas, for one thing, which I will also do, we need to look at it on a per capita basis. It is not the case that Liechtenstein and China, while both countries are equivalent units. It may be a difference. Additionally, we have within the selective framework, a theoretical insight, which I will outline since I won't be able to show it to you, that tells me that certain types of democracies don't unravel. So in the selective theory, we can divide any country into three groups of people. The general population, il populo, the leadership and the people whose support is essential to keep a leader in power, the winning coalition. The welfare of leaders is strictly decreasing as the number of people they depend on to stay in power increases, as they become more accountable, more democratic. The welfare of citizens is strictly increasing as the size of that winning coalition, the number of people that needs to stay in power is increasing. The welfare of members of the coalition looks like the Nike swoosh curve. It looks like this. When the coalition is really small down here, getting bigger that way, and this is how well compensated they are. When the coalition is really small, people are getting lots of private goods, corruption opportunities, they're getting rich. As the coalition gets bigger, two things are happening. First, the goodies have to be divided among more people, so there's a dilution effect. But the leader has to spend more revenue to keep the coalition loyal, not backing the challenger. Oh, I was doing so well, thank you. We'll skip that, we'll skip that. Here we go. Okay, so as the coalition gets bigger, the leader, because the cost of bribing people gets to be too expensive, the leader gradually is shifting to producing better policies, public goods, healthcare, infrastructure, so forth. And this has a consequence. So I've just projected a line across that function. And you'll see that so on the horizontal axis, we have how big the coalition is. Bigger coalition in sort of conventional language, more democratic. I don't like to say democratic and authoritarian because I don't know what those mean. I do know a continuum of more accountable, less accountable. So you see, as the coalition gets bigger, this welfare curve turns up, and you see there's a second welfare curve there, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a point where the welfare of the coalition and a large coalition is equal to their welfare if the coalition were as small as it could be, the local maximum. When you pass that point, the coalition members can only be better off by being more democratic, by being more accountable, by having a larger coalition. They can't be made better off by shrinking the coalition because their welfare is above what it would be at the smallest level that it could reach, at the maximum, that's the local maximum. No country, 200 years of data, no country, none, zero, that has passed that cut point has voluntarily stopped being democratic. None, nor have they had a successful coup or revolution. The only countries that passed that cut point that stopped being democratic were conquered by Nazi Germany. And when the Germans were thrown out, they became democratic again. But I have, you see this dotted gray line, the steepness of the slope and where it's minimized depends on how efficiently public goods are produced. So in a country like the United States, they're produced very efficiently. In a country like India, they are produced inefficiently. They don't have a lot of human capital, not a well-educated population and so forth. Then the slope is flatter. That cut point comes much later. Those places are at risk of erosion of democracy. And you can see here, if I project from a given size coalition why this might be, well, the coalition can be made better off if it's a low productivity society by purging some people. For those who survive the purge, their welfare goes up. That's the lower arrow. But the upper arrow from the same size coalition to the same size, they're made worse off. Their welfare is decreased. So they don't have an incentive to stop being democratic. Okay, so why do people think that democracy is in trouble? Here's the short view, which we've been talking about. This is a little bit longer view than 2020 to 20.
Yes, yeah.
This is 2000 to 2025. And the red line is the polity data, and the black line is the size of the winning coalition. It's the median year by year globally. And we see the polity number has plummeted. And we can see as well that the coalition size number has dropped in the last few years. Exactly what we just saw, 2020 to 2025, it's dropped. That's a short-term view. Let's take a look at that same view. Who knows? Oh, there we go. Okay. let's take a look at that from a longer perspective, post-World War II. There's that same drop in the corner, but you see it's tiny. And notice we're in a very narrow range of the scale. The actual drop is noise. It's inconsequential. That's true of the polity, and it's even more true of the coalition size measure. So when we look at a bit longer period, like post-World War II, what we are seeing in the last few years is just noise. It's just a bounce. It doesn't look like it's more than that. If we take a really long view, so I'm going back to 1800, and you can see that drop on the polity measure and the smaller drop on the coalition measure. And you see the world, just as we just saw, the world bounces around, and it's mostly upward, with this tiny little noisy drop in the last few years, but still way up compared to where it was. The world is not becoming autocratic. That's long trends. All right. How about repression? I thought this would be about repression, not, war, but nice to study war. Okay, I want you to notice that the vertical axis is in an extremely narrow range. So we're talking about a variable that can range between 0 and 1, and this vertical axis is between 0.3 and 0.38. And what I'm plotting is a measure of government use of torture. And we see, again, since 2020, it's spiked up. And that seems worrisome. It's lower than it was back in 2000, but it has spiked up right there. But if we break that apart to ask, where did it spike up? So I've divided the world into countries that are in the upper third, lower third, and middle third of the coalition size, autocratic, mid-range places, and democratic. You can see the green line is democratic. We're not seeing much repression in the green line. And we see, it's slightly downwardly sloped. And we are seeing, for the global median, a significant drop in repression. Where has repression risen? In autocratic states. But they were already autocratic. They were already repressive. They've gotten worse. It's not the democracies that have joined that club. It's the autocrats who are even worse behaved than they were in the last few years, perhaps because they're under pressure. And here we see a very ugly slide with lots of countries listed, but here we're looking at current coalition size and the change in coalition size. So what we're seeing is the countries, the black line is the change in coalition size over 50 years. And what we're seeing is it has spiked up to increase substantially. And we see that it's small coalition places that have become more autocratic. They're negative on this scale. The larger coalition places are positive on the scale. They've moved to democracy. If we look at repression per capita, we see that the mean and the median have dropped, not risen, in the period since the end of World War II. And if we look at productivity, the thing that drives the steepness of the slope of that swoosh curve, we see that productivity reduces repression. Societies that educate their population more are less repressive. And if we break societies down into the size of their coalition and the size of their productivity, educational attainment, that is how steep that swoosh curve is, and I've done a very simple breakdown above and below the median. Very crude, just keep things simple. So the columns are productivity level of educational attainment for those 15 years old and older, and the rows are the coalition is above the median or below the median. And what we are looking at is who has engaged in repression since 1946. And we see that if you're a large coalition, high productivity society, you have the lowest score of any of these 4 categories. That's not where repression is on the rise. It's not where the problem is. And we see, if we look in the most recent year for which I had data, 2022, same story. It is the high productivity, large coalition societies that have the least repressive behavior. So, yeah, we're seeing a lot of unpleasantness in the world, but it's actually not being produced by democracy. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Yeah. But I want you to look at institutions and perceived or unrealized risks, where I'm trying to explain the occurrence of repression. And you see coalition size by itself has a very strong negative effect. India is an example of a high coalition, small productivity place, high productivity, but small coalition size, the second column, a second row. China is an example, relatively improving education, and it significantly increases repression. What does the massive, so you have to sum these to get the total effect. Coalition size times productivity, so it's the sum, minus 46 plus 58 minus 62, so strongly negative number. Democratic and productive societies, highly educated societies, massively reduce the level of repression. And I conclude with that. Well, I know what's going on. That the concern that the world is de-democratizing, autocratizing, and becoming a more violent, repressive place is the consequence of a very short-term blip, noisy blip in the data that, when looked at a little bit longer term, is meaningless. It's tiny blip. So I am an optimist. There you go.
So this violates one of my fundamental rules, which is never follow Bruce, never follow Jim Scott, never follow Charles Tilly. So my triad of people never to follow, I'm already violating it. So thank you, Bruce. You're very kind.
There we go.
So I, like everyone else, had a slightly different take on Dan's call. But Dan being Dan, I'm like, dude, I'm probably not gonna like it. I'm gonna subvert. And so he said, do what you do. He welcomes challenges. And so and his alternative name for the panel was Don't Call It a Comeback. So I thought he would lose that. I thought he would put that back in there. So I put that back in. Thank you. LL Cool J for those that did that. But partly I view Dan's setup as this kind of like large scale, kind of like correlation of sorts, right? Like, okay, so we have national level characteristics, we have national level behavior or behavior that's directed against different units. And I'm kind of like, no, I wasn't accepting that at all. And what I mean by I'm not accepting it. It's not just.
He does bar mitzvahs too.
Yes. That is the next one. Okay. So I view these kind of like very straightforward dichotomous characteristics that he kind of gave us, right? It's like war, civil war, democracy, autocracy. And so I was kind of like, not really anymore. So I don't know that I could accept your characterization of what was taking place, because I think we've kind of moved past that in many respects. And what I mean is twofold. One, on the conflict side, you could think of, there's a whole bunch of people that talk about interstate conflict, right? You got militarized interstate disputes, armed conflict, proxy wars, economic conflict, cyber attacks, domestic destabilization, environmental conflict, diplomatic conflict, all these different forms. And then, to be clear, Bruce is part of like the founding group of the Correlates of War people, which was based here at Michigan. And so that was very near and dear to him, myself as well. So at a certain point, there's a bunch of defectors that come from Michigan and go to Binghamton. That's where I got my degree. And then basically they set up shop with Bremer coming back from Germany and all these other people. And so my rebellious nature was, I'm not doing interstate conflict. That's what you all do. I'm doing something else, right? Because the point of the PhD is you're going to do something that's distinct and unique. And so my rebellious bit was I did interstate conflict. And so the interstate conflict, state-sponsored, systematic violence and oppression, genocide, state political state repression, but also like everyday resistance, sabotaged banditry, civil wars, wars of secession, resource-driven conflicts, communal identity-based conflict, terrorism, counterterrorism, revolution, counter-revolution, all these different forms. Now, if you accept or go back to Dan's kind of characterization of these two as being distinct, I'm like, not anymore. Actually, when we start thinking about kind of like where they're coming from and how we should think about them, that difference is quite permeable. Now, in many respects, I'm going to argue all forms of political conflict violence should be evaluated together. So we can get to things like substitution. So we can get to things like coevolution. So we can get to things like talking about repertoires. But also, the better frame might be, we need to start thinking about like how they influence one another. So Rwanda, 1994, we generally kind of focus on the genocide because that's kind of where people start. But it's like, okay, it started by people invading from Uganda, going into Rwanda in 1990. So that was a war. And then they got stopped. Some humanitarian efforts, peacemaking, peace building, stuff falls apart. Then the conflict begins again. And then they call that thing that started again a civil war, which isn't quite right because it's like an internationalized civil war, which is a category, but it doesn't need to be placed into that particular context. And then it turns into a genocide. But if you play out exactly or identify exactly how the genocide played out, there was this, if you go to my genodynamics project, we show that the way that the RPF pushed individuals to Congo was very conscientious because they wanted to follow them. And then Kagame follows them in the sense that he arms and supports Kabila, and then he gets rid of him. And so it's just kind of like, if you look at the Africa World War stuff that people talk about, how do you separate those? Is it possible to talk about Congo without talking about Rwanda? Is it possible to talk about Rwanda without talking about Uganda? Is it possible to talk about any of these without talking about the French of the US? And so our conceptions have been changed. Also very near and dear, the transnational repression stuff, right? So Paul Rusesabagina lives in Texas, yo. He got a phone call, got catfished, went to Qatar, got drugged, got stuck in Rwanda, tortured and repressed, and then the US is trying to get him out. He ends up getting out, which was a student from the class. I had a class called Saving the World or Wasting Time. And so every week we met with Paul's daughters in class to talk about what we could do to help him get out. And one day she stopped us, one of the daughters, Karine, and she's just like, she stops and she goes, look, and she's like very emotional and you could see it. And we were just like, oh, is it a bad week? Because we had those weeks too. And she's like, no, it's a great week. He's on a plane. And like the whole class is falling. And I'm just kind of going, I'm like, so also emotional, but I'm kind of like, damn, how do you top that? I'm like, a class should just end at that point. I'm just like, we had like another third for the class to go. And I'm just like, okay, but transnational repression. And then Paul Karegeya in South Africa gets killed as well. And it's just like, all right, so I'm not going along with this distinction of the different forms. And so I think our evaluation needs to kind of shift accordingly with that. Related. So if I say subnational democracy, we don't know that much about it now because it's really kind of a newish phenomena. Unless you're fans of Putnam, right? You're just like, oh, how many Italys were there? Or you're thinking of like, well, Alabama's never been really democratic relative to like New Jersey or New York. And so let's be honest. So we've always been familiar with the concept, but we never really had any data. But like in the last 5 to 10 years, a whole bunch of people start now talking about subnational democracy. And that's, I think, important as we start talking about these global trends, because it's like, what is it fair to rank a nation as a single score across a particular dimension? Probably not. But what does that variation have to tell us? How much variation subverts the overall score? On what dimensions maybe is it possible to talk about a uniform score? I think these things are complicating my willingness to kind of go with Dan. So I'm just like, all units within a territory should be evaluated individually, and then we explore combinations, which theoretically we haven't really done well, but I think would be incredibly useful as we start trying to think about whether or not the world is turning one way or another, right? And then the better frame would be, we need to start worrying about, exploring, and thinking about theorizing how these subnational components do or do not give us a larger entity or a simplifying narrative in many ways. So the US, this is from David Vine's book, The United States of War. David doesn't talk about any variation with regards to violent behavior from the United States. He argues that from 1776 to 2020, we've been constantly involved in some type of form of violent behavior someplace on the planet, which then makes you wonder about these trends as well as we're thinking about these entities. Also linking the behavior that's taking place domestically and the behavior that's taking place internationally. But then that's just kind of violent behavior. If you think of infrastructure, we've more or less consistently, the United States have had military bases throughout the United States. I think we have 90% of the military bases on the planet consistently since World War II. That hasn't varied. So whatever's going on with regards to the institutions, the military bases are useful. David makes all this stuff available. He looks at the implications of having these bases and what is subverted within these locations. But then becomes also interesting. And as Bruce was hinting at, we have different conceptions of democracy, right? We have the deliberative democracy, liberal democracy, electoral democracy, egalitarian democracy. And if you're looking over time, this is from VDEM. As those who know me, I don't like VDEM, but I do like the longish time series, and I do think we need to unpack that as well. And they do have some national measurements now, which is one of the things that we're starting to work with. But again, who would argue that indigenous people in the United States and the democracy that they've been exposed to is comparable to that of other groups? So group level experience, spatially variant experiences of democracy, these kind of militate against the general setup that Dan gave us initially. And I think that's what made it hard for me to kind of answer the question, because I just had these data and these concepts in my head as I was trying to think about the answer. And initially, starting where Megan was, and I'm just kind of like, oh, let me download some data and look. And then I stopped and I'm just like, nah, I'm looking at different data right now. So I'm just kind of like, what's the subnational stuff have to tell us? And then realizing, oh, well, actually, no one really knows the subnational data. So it's hard to answer this question. No one's done this type of analysis. So I think that was an important opening. And like winding down. Oh, did I skip my DRC? Yes. So everyone should read the case of the DRC. The first Congolese war, the second Congolese war, whatever they're calling the current thing with Rwanda, it is complex. There are multiple actors involved. Those multiple actors are not just in the Congo, they're coming from all over Africa into this location. And okay, is this just an African problem? I don't think so, but it is something that we need to acknowledge, as it is throwing into a very complex categorization whether or not something is international or national, and whether or not it's war or not war. Because if I'm paying to have somebody put into office in another location to subjugate people within that particular nation, what is that? Because it's taking place domestically, but that person is being supported internationally. And we need to look at exactly how those things are playing out across different types of jurisdictions. And this is the most recent, I think, from 20 to 23 of the March 23 movement, which is kind of like Rwanda light. I mean, this is all Kagame's people, and our lack of talking about this place has been quite something. But And then the different types of democracy point, I think, is played out there. But now I'm thinking of minimum winning coalitions as well. So just kind of like, I'm like, oh, okay. VDEM isn't coding that yet, but perhaps they will get to that. And I think that was all I had. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Great set of like counter provocations to the provocation. Lots of interesting data, lots of interesting argumentation. So we have a good bit of time for Q&A. So I don't know if we need to pass around the microphone, but please, lots to dig into. So open it up to our fair audience.
Yeah, that's one to talk. I have my.
I bet if you stand up, start walking, people will be more ready to like,
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, no. Thank you. Thank you all. These were great presentations. So this question is for Bruce. It's about your optimism, which is encouraging. So you mentioned that once a country gets past that cut point on that swoosh, it hasn't backslid. Presumably the United States is past that cut point, but the president does appear to be attempting to shrink the size of his winning coalition. And so I guess my question about that is, what does selectorate theory, what are kind of the mechanisms by which that is going to be resisted, or what does the theory say will stop that from happening?
So to start, let me observe that according to the selector theory, every political leader, if they don't have their hands tied, one shrink, because it is easier to survive in office the smaller the coalitions on which depend. The average leader of a country with a large winning coalition that's well educated, the average time in office is 5.25 years. If you are low on winning coalition size and low on productivity, on education, it's over 10 years. It's much better to run that. So Trump is trying to do what any sensible leader would try to do for themselves, not for us. The theory tells us that when a leader who's above that cut point tries to reduce the coalition, they get a lot of pushback because people's welfare will be diminished, not enhanced. So we've seen the beginnings of that. Hard as it is to believe, he's only been in office 9 months. We've had 2 No Kings marches, for example. First one had 5 million people, the second one had 7 million people. My guess is the next one will have 10 million people. We see at the local level, not just the country, at the local level, in places where he is intervening most aggressively, Portland, Chicago, places like that. People are on the streets all the time. People are filming what's going on all the time. The courts are constantly being asked to adjudicate what's going on. All of these things are political costs for trying to shrink the coalition. That doesn't mean he'll stop trying, but it means that we, the people, will push back, need to push back, and if the theory is right, he'll be defeated in his effort.
Okay, this question is also for Professor Bueno de Mesquita. Your point about that we should think about autocratization on a per capita basis is well taken, but the VDEM indices aren't capturing that. So I just would ask you to reflect on some of these countries with a lot of capita that have experienced declines that don't seem like blips. Like India is not a blip. The US, I don't know if it's a blip, but like getting us to the post Jim Crow era, back to like late 70s, early 80s doesn't feel like a blip, but maybe I'm biased as an American. Dan could probably speak to Indonesia. I don't know if that's a blip. Pakistan doesn't seem like a blip. I don't know about Brazil, but those were just some thoughts I had. I was wondering if you could reflect. Thank you.
Did you say Pakistan?
Yeah, also in terms of, autocratization and autocracies.
Remember that cut point. Pakistan is nothing close to that cut point. They are, first of all, not a very large winning coalition, 0.6 on the scale, and they're low productivity. So I don't see them. I say this as somebody who was a South Asianist in my earlier life. I have never thought of Pakistan as in the democratic set. Now, it doesn't feel like a blip at the moment. That's a good thing, because that's why we, the people, will rise up and are rising up against it. I'm just saying that when we look at the long-term evidence, it's very hard to see those declines as meaningful numbers. It's when we zoom in on very short term and we have very narrow scales on the vertical axis that it looks consequential. Per capita, so yeah, VDEM doesn't measure anything per capita, but we know the population of every country. So we can find ways to capture population size. I'm going to take a minute to give an example of how the failure to do that leads people to serious errors in my view, in their assessment of what's happening in the international arena. So I'm going to pick on standard accounts of China's rise. China today has the second largest economy in the world. I like to ask my students, who had the second largest economy in the world in 1900? And people usually answer, maybe Britain, maybe Germany. It was China. China was the first, the largest economy in the world in 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, and 1900. Trading places with India. If you have a big enough population, you have a big economy. Gross economy is not a measure of how a place is performing. The remarkable story about China is that from 1900 to 1980, it went from second to fifth, not that it went back to second today. People look at growth rates as an indication of the expansion of the authoritarian state. In 1980, for example, under Deng Xiaoping's good ideas, the Chinese economy grew by 10%. Per capita income in China in 1980 was $431, according to the World Bank. So it grew by $43. The United States per capita income in 1980 was about $30,000. So nobody would have noticed $43 in increase. The United States grew at a much slower rate because the denominator was a lot bigger. If we ask how much has China narrowed the per capita income gap with the United States between 1980 and today, anybody want to shout out a guess? $1,000, $10,000, $30,000. But how much has China narrowed the gap with the United States on per capita income? Not you, Jim. They haven't, it's increased. In 1980, it was 431 versus 30,000. Today, China is about $14,500, and the United States is 80,000. The United States per capita income grew by $50,000, and China's grew by $14,000. If you compare per capita income performance in China and Taiwan, they looked almost identical using Angus Mattson data for long-term history from 1820 until about 1960. In 1968, Taiwan introduced compulsory education through 9th grade. And China didn't do that till 1986. And in 1987, Taiwan became democratic. So it's almost a natural experiment. They had the same culture, same history, etc. What's happened in per capita income terms is that Taiwan is soaring away from China. The combination of education and large winning coalition democracy has put them far ahead. We panic over short-term blips. If we look at even not very long-term change, we will see that all of the action in terms of achieving prosperity, longevity, good, well, all of the sort of quality of life indicators are produced by 2, maybe 3 features: size of the winning coalition, level of educational attainment, and how much freedom. So we're pessimists because we're looking at blips.
Well, I gotta thank Professor Davenport and Bueno de Mesquita for coming into my classes the last few days. That's been very cool with Dr. Nordas. So thank you guys. I had a question for Professor Davenport. So you mentioned about the interstate and interstate is starting to become more mixed. Or taking photos of me too. So these two types of conflicts are becoming more intermixed. And I remember we talked about that in the Rwanda conflicts, how it's in Rwanda, but also in Congo. I wanted to ask you, is that something that's happening in a more global scale right now? Or are we seeing other wars in the world that are progressively becoming more intertwined?
So I think, I don't know that I said things were becoming more related. I was challenging our characterization that we've inherited from these earlier projects that separated things, right? So Cow was all about interstate war, and then they had civil war, and then they had like was like colonial wars. I mean, there's like, but it was all war, right? So if I was just interested in like one-sided killing or genocide, you're not going there. And so other projects got started to kind of identify those forms. And so what I'm suggesting is they're perhaps all related, and simultaneously we should evaluate all of them, and we should see what the different combinations are yielding in terms of different things. So that the United States government assisted in the assassination of Lumumba and then facilitated the military dictatorship that comes in afterwards and supports it so that it can do whatever. I'm like, and then that generally would look like a domestic affair, but now we realize, okay, it was an international affair. So I'm suggesting that we need to look at these distinct forms of conflict and violence together and identify exactly how they're co-evolving across time. But it's probably always been the case. Yeah.
So it's not that they are together as much as we should just analyze them together.
I think they are together. I think the transnational oppression literature is explicitly trying to identify exactly how governments in one territorial jurisdiction are following their best interests in other people's territorial jurisdictions. And so that's the most explicit thing. I make that connection along with internationalized civil war, right? As a category, it's like, okay, these people came from here, or these people are hiding there. That's also very clear. But then the United States in Guantanamo Bay, which is in another country, I'm like, okay, so, or we want to torture somebody, but we're not going to do it here. So we'll find a country that can do it, or that's not. So it's like things they're way more fluid in terms of the use of coercion and force than we've allowed for historically, because these projects, which are rather large, right? It takes a lot to kind of, okay, let's identify all MIDs on the planet. Okay, that's a huge effort. Okay, let's identify all human rights violations. Let's identify all instances of torture. Just set out to kind of like try to do that thing. And so all these things are very complex in and of themselves, but frankly, that's just been an artifact of how we were conducting these projects. And some of these projects need to just kind of like integrate, but some of them like Cameo and other ones, they had a wide variety of events that they were looking at, and they were kind of like pulled together. So we just need to kind of adopt that as the thing that we're acknowledging. And that repertorial changes are something that really take place in the world. And maybe what we're interested in is like how we go from these interstate things to these domestic things. Maybe the smartest move that the United States did relative to the Brits, where there's like, okay, you know what? Forget putting flags on stuff. Let's just run the leaders. Let them subjugate for us. And then we won't run across the kind of like anti-colonial things that you see against the British later on. So together, better understand.
I'll chew on that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for very helpful introductions. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm a sociologist, and as such, I always think about what the variables are telling us beyond the actual numbers, and I think about the people. And I want you to reflect a little bit, and I think Mr. Davenport was reaching at this point where there are minorities who are the targets of this authoritarian tendencies, trends that you reported probably recently. So yeah, we could say on average, the economy is better, but we also know that some people cannot afford the things that, an average person could afford 30, 40 years ago in the States or in other places of the world. Study political minorities. That's my focus. And when I look at all of this, the index and how on paper many of these places look democratic, then we look exactly at democracy for what type of people, if who was incorporated. Can you reflect a little bit on the impact of these events that we are observing currently that are actually inflicting exclusion on particular and historically excluded populations? And I am not thinking about just the categories that you presented in your PowerPoint, but also political minorities, because we need to think about democracy substantively more than just the historical trends. Because yeah, we're doing better, but who is continuously historically excluded? Thank you so much.
I'll take a first stab if anybody else wants to jump in. So one of the things that I thought about regarding the prompt from Dan was I was kind of like, I don't know to what extent like Black people in particular be going, yeah, the democracy is eroding and violence is increasing. In fact, and we do it very, because we don't poll Black communities well enough, we don't have enough, a large enough end, so it's very difficult to get a group variation and compare them to others. But I think if you look at group specific evaluations of the democracy, we would see some stability across some communities that they've always perceived the democracy to not be serving them well, and to believe that they've been subject to violence, right? So the very trend that we were identifying as a kind of foil against which we kind of like think about what's going on wouldn't be uniform across different groups within the society, which I think is informative in and of itself. And so maybe what we're seeing is a decent part of the white community is now perceiving institutions and behavior in a particular way, and they are more connected to venues that will distribute this information and this message to other parts of the population. So now it seems like it's something that's new. Whereas these other groups, I mean, so in the 60s and 70s, there was just a wider variety of different types of media that different groups had that were distributed within their communities. I mean, you mentioned a sociologist, there was a field once of ethnic newspapers. It was like, we don't really have newspapers anymore, and we definitely don't have ethnic ones, but they spoke to those particular communities and they would speak to their concerns in a little bit more dramatic and straightforward fashion that would allow us to see these nuances with regards to how the democracy is or is not believed to be functioning. So I think that some communities are kind of looking around going, it's like, what, this isn't new. It's like, what democracy? I mean, so I was always Pamela Paxton, I think was her name, who did the suffrage database, right? I was very much a fan of her data. I was just like, well, let's look at suffrage. I'm like, okay, so that for me is like, okay, America's not a democracy until 65, 70 with the Civil and Voting Rights Act. So I'm just kind of like, okay, you put that into people's models and then that changes things dramatically. But if your conception of democracy is somewhat different, or you're relying upon different conceptions of it as identified before, then you come up with different conclusions. The group specific democracy or the spatially specific democracy thing I find fascinating because like, okay, so then you have these authoritarian enclaves that exist within a territory that is believed to be, I mean, so it just makes things very confusing. I'm just like, okay, so what's Mississippi in 1967 and 1968? Clearly it's an authoritarian enclave. Okay, and there's appeal to some Democratic Party to then, I'm like, wow, it gets really complex. So the single indicator, the single conception of it, I think is very difficult to frame accurate conversations. But clearly our literature has been about, this is where the political institutions are going. This is where the behavior is going. This thing is correlated. And I'm just kind of going, so this is my dissertation. This is most of my work, right? So I'm indicting myself. I like the fact that we were able to establish some of these connections, but clearly the territorial aggregation up to the nation state was a hook that was problematic, given that Mississippi could continue doing what it was doing. And then we were ignoring that, or we were ignoring other kind of enclaves. I lived in Houston for a while, and I was shocked to go to these courts that they had where they were evaluating 12-year-olds and the consistency of their testimony with regards to how they got to America. And it's like, there's one person that spoke Spanish in addition to this kid, everybody else spoke English, and they just kept grilling this 12-year-old on consistency. And the minute he was inconsistent, it's back on a bus and go back to whatever hell you came from. And so I'm like, wow, that's the same thing as Manhattan. I'm just like, how are these the same territorial unit, right? So I think the internal variation is like, that's the new thing that we can explore. And I think that renders all of these arguments and analyses in quite interesting dynamics, because we're just like, okay, does selective theory hold out at the city council level? Does it hold out at the city level, the state? Do you need a concentration of kind of like regional concatenations of these things in order to kind of play out? Do they need to be layered in particular ways in order to play out? So I think that's kind of like the space we're in, which I think is an incredibly useful one to be in. But anyway,
Let me start with your question about the selector theory. So if you look at the congressional district level, and you look at the size of the winning coalition measured as the vote of the second party, because it's a first past the post system, what you will discover is that per capita income is poorly predicted by whether the district is Democrat or Republican, but very well predicted by whether the second largest part, whether the race was close. And where the winning coalition is larger, that is, the race was close, per capita income is much higher by county level, by congressional district level. So the selector theory is not a normative theory. It's not trying to express how we would like the world to be. It's trying to describe how we believe the world works. And so I'd like to say a positive and a negative response to your question. On the negative side, it's a very depressing theory. It tells us that democracies, for example, in their foreign affairs, in equilibrium, should be expected to be badly behaved. For a very simple reason. The job of a democratically elected leader is to make her or his constituents happy so that they will get reelected. And if that means extracting stuff from people elsewhere, then they'll do that. So it's very, it doesn't say democracy is inherently good. It says democracy produces more public goods at home, and it does lots of very nasty things in foreign affairs. On the question, however, of quality of life, 45% of the world's population, that's almost 1 out of every 2 people, earns $6.85 a day or less. That is so low an income that the United States doesn't even track a group in that income. So the poorest people in the United States are rich by comparison to 45% of the world's population. A meta-study of street beggars in American cities reports that their average income is $50 to $80 per day, compared to $6.85 for 45% of the world's population. Now, the selector theory also tells us that I care if I'm a leader in a democracy, I care about keeping my winning coalition happy. I don't care about the rest of the people. Mr. Trump is very good at that. He cares about the MAGA crowd. He doesn't care about everybody else. So then the virtue of democracy is that when the coalition is very large, it's too expensive to bribe millions of people, so you produce public goods. Now you do whatever corruption, private exchanges you can. That's what the tax system is about. It's, I'm going to take money from the people who vote against me, and I'm going to give it to the people who vote for me. We notice that when Mr. Trump does it, but of course the Democrats do exactly the same thing. The nature of tax policy in the United States is the party that wins raises taxes on the people who didn't vote for them and transfers that money in programs to the people who did vote for them. The Republicans do that and the Democrats do that. So it's a depressing view in that it's not about uplift. Nobody's in this theory, nobody's trying to lift the people up to make them better off. They're just trying to get reelected. And if that means I have to lift people up, I do that. And the fewer people I can lift up, the better. So, you know, there it is. It's not normative, but that's the logic.
Yeah, and just thank you for your question. One, sort of, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, for many people in the US and elsewhere, they've never experienced like a full democracy, egalitarian democracy, but that doesn't mean it couldn't get worse. And I'm wondering, and I feel like I'm seeing that even if there's never been good, is it getting worse? And I think the answer to that, I mean, it might be for a short time period, and maybe this is just like in the moment now, but my sense is that it is. And I also, studying political violence, thinking my other research looks at during the Reconstruction period, where I definitely you see it getting worse after Reconstruction ends, right? Similarly with political violence, relatively like over global trends. I mean, I remember vividly Tilly's work that homicides around within a country have declined precipitously since the 1500s, but that doesn't mean that it can't get worse. And so maybe at this period, it's the time period that I'm just considering is just too small to really understand political violence. So maybe the broad trend is that, but in this moment, it feels like it's getting worse. And the same way that democracy might be getting worse for some, I wonder if political violence is getting worse for the same or similar set. And so in my when I'm thinking, I don't have the data to measure it necessarily at the subnational level, but when I wonder, for many people, will their experience remain relatively unchanged, but for others, even it was never perfect, but is it getting worse? And my concern is that it is.
Hi, this question is related to kind of contrasting view Megan and Bruce pointed at. It was very interesting observation for at the back. My question to Bruce is like, because we have many students here, and then like every day they probably think, what kind of action do you have to take? And then Megan pointed at, it might take time, but we have to make effort. But your optimism might give us wrong impression that just keep calm and live your life. So I wonder, like, what would you suggest to young folks here?
So, right, we the people are the pressure point that will stop Donald Trump from achieving its desire to shrink the coalition. So, as you know, as a researcher, I try not to have or express personal opinions about activist politics. As a citizen, I believe deeply in activism. The optimism is because the theory tells me that people will push back, not that we don't need to push back, because it's not magic. It's not that he will be stopped because there's a curve that says, oh, we're above the cut point. He will be stopped because what that curve says is we will all be made worse off by what he wants to do, and therefore we as citizens, as opposed to as academics, need to push back. And I marched in the two No Kings marches. I had not demonstrated since the Vietnam War, since I was a student here. That was a really long time ago, because I didn't see an issue where I thought it would make a difference and where I felt sufficiently threatened that I felt it was necessary. I view a lot of demonstrations in democratic countries as social events. These are not social events. They are social, but they are. This tells us we have to push back. So don't be complacent. Push. Make noise.
And so to that, I would add, I mean, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the role of sort of transnational activist movements. So much in the same way violence is transnational or can be transnational. I was thinking like historically decolonization, anti-apartheid, water, big transnational movements and activists. And if we think that democracy moves in waves and can diffuse, and authoritarianism moves in waves and diffuse, that means that it's a global project. It's not just, it's as much a local as a global. And so I wonder if in addition to kind of local activism here and maintaining that, we also have to think more broadly about the struggles and interconnections worldwide that can be interlinked in this project. Yeah.
I apologize, I'm going to object.
Okay.
Okay. Let me take as an example, global warming. So, with which I am very concerned. I had this conversation with former British Prime Minister Brown. Global warming is a global problem. I agree. Therefore, it needs a global solution. That is a false syllogism. And it's a dangerous syllogism. It's dangerous because when we say it requires a global solution, we are inviting the collective action problem. We are inviting free riding. We are inviting exactly what you were concerned about, that people will be complacent because somebody else will take care of it. My cost is too high relative to my benefit. Local action, I think, is vastly more important because at the local action level, the collective action problem is greatly diminished. Our end is smaller, our benefit relative to the cost is larger. So a danger in calling for global action is exactly what we've seen in the environmental movement. We had Kyoto, 175 countries initially signed on, of which only 37 had to do anything to be in compliance, and virtually none did. And then we had Copenhagen, in which it was a promise of $100 billion per year fund, and that fund is up to around $20 billion, however many years. And then we had Paris, and everybody made wonderful promises with no sanctions, no monitoring. Jim has written extensively about the importance of sanctioning and monitoring in strategic situations. So while we're well-intentioned when we invite global action, the consequence is less action if people don't take actual steps. So I'm all for it's a local problem.
All right, thank you. This is great. Thank you, Dan, for putting this together. So my question is for Professors Stewart and Davenport. Kind of thinking about what was said about subnational democratization. Obviously, we have work by like Rob Mickey, the authoritarian enclave stuff. Recent work by like Rumbach, trying to start to put together subnational indicators of democracy. I guess my question is, one, do you think we're on the right track with that type of work? And then two, what can we learn from kind of the IR community about like lessons from polity, lessons from BDEM, that as scholars of American politics, we can begin to incorporate into thinking about constructing measures of subnational democracy?
Yes. Are we in the right direction? I think we're in the right direction, but the analogy that I think of in terms of the conflict community that I know best, I think we're in the subnational political characteristics realm. We're like in the 70s. We just getting started. I mean, so when the Trump administration was coming in the second time, I was talking with some VDEM people, and then Michael Coppage from VDEM came here last year, and I'm listening to Michael speak. And so when VDEM got started, I was at Notre Dame. He started his project, and I started a project at the same time. We both had different conceptions of what experts were. His worked. It's large, it's fine, but there's some limitations with regards to some of it. But I heard him speak and I'm just kind of going, why isn't there a VDEM USA? I mean, like, we have all types of data. My problem with VDEM is that you're asking a single individual to code 300 characteristics for several hundred years. That's just ridiculous. And you know, Freedom House there's like 7 different categories for like a year, and people had problems with that. So I thought that was highly problematic. But I'm kind of like, we have so much other data that we can compare against. Sure, let's get some opinions from a bunch of different people that consider themselves experts, and then we can compare it against all this actual data that we have on all these different things. Voting booths, behavior, all these types of things. So I was excited about that, contacted VDEM, and now we're in the process of developing grants for that. But I'm kind of like, why do I have to do that? I'm just like, you know, why wasn't VDEM doing that already? Why, because they're global, right? I'm just like, why wasn't the subnational push there? Well, partly because they're rolling with their 5 to 7 experts for a single country thing, and they weren't thinking about, well, we have hundreds of other types of data that we can compare these attitudes and networks to. And so, you know, now it needed to be this combination, but they do have the infrastructure for it. And they do have funding streams for it. So that's better than we were in the 70s, right? But now we have an infrastructure for how to do it. We have a bunch of people that are interested in doing it. We have some sense of the different characteristics. I mean, I don't like VDEM in part because they make it seem like repression is part of democracy. I'm just like, you wish. I'm like, okay, yeah. If that was only the case, then all positive things were associated with democracy, right? So I'm not a maximalist. But I think we now have enough awareness of the different characteristics, the different conceptions, the different ways of measuring it, the different ways of pulling it together, that in that respect, I think we're optimistic in terms of what could be pulled off and how we can think about this subnational political characteristics business. And when you look at like subnational measures of autocracy, okay, they're way ahead of the subnational measures of democracy, people. But again, infrastructure is set up, we can just turn into these other characteristics and like kind of like run with it. So from that perspective, I think it's a great time for that type of enterprise.
Yeah, so I think one you know, when I was thinking about this, like with polity in particular, one thing that really struck out to me is that the period of Reconstruction in the US, the last time I checked, was basically not coded at all. And which I find to be really quite striking. Yeah, it's an interregnum period. And then after the women get the right to vote, there's no change in polity scores, which I find, you know, ostensibly quite a large expansion of the franchise. However, yeah, quite a large expansion, but you know, not coded as any change in democratization. And then I was reading a lot about the democratization literature in political science, and much of it bases its definition on democratization on universal male suffrage, for instance. So a lot of the way that we like in politics, how we understand democratization happening, is already on a limited understanding of what democracy is, and a democracy for a few. And so to that end, one of the things, actually to get to Professor Davenport's earlier point, about substitution logic. So in some of the research that I've been doing recently and other things that I've started to see is that some countries have used different access to the franchise as sort of substitute for each other. So taking away from some, giving it to others, and sort of as ways to maintain control that look like they're expanding the access, but they're actually making it more complicated. And I think we can start to see some of these substitutionary logics, both with democratization or both with political institutions or other forms of political institutions, alongside forms of political violence as well. And I think some of those can be, I think it might be interesting to also see the overlap between the two. And in particular, you know, the extent to which forms of political violence and sort of changes in political institutions are interrelated. So I think that's what IR comparative politics, what politics can bring to bear on it. Yeah.
Great. So this is really terrific. We're going to have to start wrapping up. I guess one kind of concluding remark I would make, kind of wrapping things up a bit here, is that we tend from watching the news to think about how things are happening at the national scale. And we even tend to, anthropomorphize different countries. So China did this today, or India did this today, or Canada did this today. And I think one thing that we can do in our scholarship is relax that and shake that up. So a big takeaway for me from today is that politics, whether it's the politics of representation and democracy and authoritarianism, or it's the politics of repression and violence and war, they take place both across territories and across groups, for lack of a better word, or for categories, as Rogers Booth would say. And we need to be attentive to the ways in which these things don't necessarily all fill that national space, but there could be interesting ways in which violence, repression, war spread across borders or stay within certain localities. We should be thinking about how the fruits of democracy and the vices of autocracy affect certain groups, certain categories of people, but not others. Maybe in certain places, maybe certain groups of time. Christian Times was saying, like, what was Mississippi in 1967? Well, Mississippi was a very different thing depending on the color of your skin. Right? So it was about different groups as opposed to a space, as opposed to a territory. So I think all of us as scholars can be thinking about how do we think about the territoriality of the things we care about? How do we think about the groupness of the things that we care about? And make sure we're being outside some of the scripts that we're seeing in the media and in the news that tend to put these things in a very kind of monolithic, homogeneous sort of way. So hopefully that's something we can all kind of work toward together. So I think it's really great. Thanks so much to Dean and Rosa for their help with the technical side of these things. Bruce Bueno, Mesquita, Christian Davenport, Megan Stewart, and everybody else for coming out. Thank you so much.